Hello. So, I guess the summer vacation's over. We've got 5.04 now. Let's talk about making an aura to track an ability with a cooldown that puts a buff on you. So if we watch in the middle of the screen, see I have this little blue thing that's letting, or orange thing, it's letting me know that I can cast Arcane Power. It's just flashing away. I'm going to build up a few more stacks to get the cooldown nice and short. Okay, so we have 10 stacks. I'm going to cast Arcane Power. You can see I got a little green thing saying, hey, you've got 30 seconds to do all your damage. And we'll just wait for this to end. And come on. There we go. And then there's a red timer saying, hey, you've got, what, 25 seconds to wait before you can do it again. So we're going to talk about making this sort of display. Maybe we'll get back in combat just so we can watch it pop up again. When this finishes, it's just going to go back to that orange display and say, hey, go create, or go use Arcane Power. 3 seconds to go. As you can see, there we go. It's pulsing orange again. So, how do we do that? You can see it's a set of 3 auras in a group. I'm going to work on just recreating this from scratch. So under New, I'm going to choose New Icon. We'll call this AP Cooldown. I'm going to make this red. And I'm going to choose an icon. Maybe something a little more, yeah, okay. I'm going to change the text to %P because that'll show how long is remaining. I'm just going to make it a bit bigger. And maybe just simpler. That's all good enough. You could come in and customize this to your heart's content, but I'm not really interested. So now we have to set up a trigger for this. And that's a status trigger. It's going to trigger off the status of our abilities. Now there are 2 ways that this can be done. One is by action usable, and that tends to work on a more complicated set of criteria. It'll check that you have the resources necessary to use an ability. So if it was like Death Strike, it would make sure that you have appropriate runes and things like that. The other one you can use is cooldown progress spell, and this one is much simpler. Do you have the ability to use this spell? Is it off cooldown? The GCD, I guess that's not really the right phrase, the rune cooldown caused by DKs can sometimes say, well, you can't use this for 6 more seconds because you have no unholy or frost runes sort of things. You can ignore that, but basically this is just, is the spell off cooldown? Yes or no? And so that's the one we want to use for Arcane Power. So I'm just going to leave it at that and put in the appropriate name. Arcane Power. Okay, now the second part of this buff is I guess I'll just duplicate this. But the second one is the actual buff on you when it's, you know, increasing your damage and mana costs. So I'm going to call this AP buff. And I'm going to switch the trigger to one that we're familiar with from before. It's just Aura. The name is the name of the buff we're tracking, so in this case it would be Arcane Power. On the player, sure, you can own only or whatever, but I'm not going to bother. And I'm going to switch the color to green. And I think what I'm going to do is just drag this a little off to the side so we can see how the 2 interact. So if I get in combat here and I Arcane Power, we can see that I have both of them on me because Arcane Power is on cooldown, but I also have the green one up because I have the Arcane Power buff. Just let this go for a sec. Then our green one goes away. So that tells us we're going to need a slightly different trigger for this cooldown buff. Basically, we need a way to say only display when Arcane Power is on cooldown and also when the buff is not on my character. So I'm going to come down to that cooldown buff, choose trigger, and I'm going to add a trigger. And this one is going to be an aura. It's going to watch for the arcane power buff. And I'm going to choose inverse. And then way up at the top, I'm going to make sure that all triggers are selected. So what this does is it's going to say, first off, is arcane power on cooldown? And second, do I have a buff called arcane power that is not on me? So I guess, as long as I do not have the arcane power buff, then this trigger will be, yep, sure, show. And if they both say, yep, sure, it's time to show, then we'll get our little red icon here in the middle of the screen. So how long do I have left? 2 seconds. I timed that pretty well. So let's get started again. We're in combat. And if we cast arcane power, you can see we just have the green one now. And can I just click this off to save time? I can. Awesome. And so as soon as we lost the arcane power buff, our red cooldown showed up. So that might be useful in PvP if someone purges it from you, or maybe a boss gets a dispel magic ability, like, was it Gar that had that? Anyway, so we're doing good so far. The last thing we want to do is have the your arcane power is ready to use pulsing icon. So I'm going to use our cooldown again. I'm going to just choose duplicate, and I'm going to call this AP ready. I'll change the color to something like an orange. I'm going to drag it up here. I'm going to get rid of the text because it's just saying, hey, this is ready. There's no timer associated with it, so I just put in a space. And let's go to the triggers. So our first trigger is this arcane power ability on cooldown? And I'm going to invert this. So the first trigger will say, this should show if arcane power is off of cooldown. And now the second one here, oops, there's occasional Lua errors when you're in the options with weak auras right now. I guess it's just like a freshly released version. Anyway, our second choice here is this arcane power buff. So we could have it so that the ready does not show if your arcane power is off cooldown, but you also have the buff. And that could happen maybe if you've spell stolen an arcane power from someone, or on that patch 4.3 5-man heroic dungeon where there's the dragon that resets your cooldowns, or I suppose later on with, not time warp, but that thing where you can rewind yourself in time. Anyway, so I'm going to leave that here just to make sure that it doesn't show up, so that I don't have the icons overlapping. So let's just leave that as is and see how this goes. So we'll get in combat, and I'm going to just stack this up to 10. What's this buff? Stolen times, just so that I can get the arcane power cooldown nice and short. Okay, 9, 10. So let's hit arcane power. We can see our nice green icon there behind the arcane missiles. There we go. And in 5 seconds we'll have arcane power off, and we get our red cooldown. And as soon as this comes off of cooldown, we'll see that our orange icon comes up again. And so I'm just using icons for this display, but you could use anything that you particularly like. If you wanted the runes or whatever from a texture display, or even 3D models if you found one that looked good. Just 5 seconds to go, and we'll make sure that the orange one pops up at the end to let us know that it's good to go. Perfect. So the last thing I'm going to do is just toss these into a group to make managing them a little easier. So we just bring up weak auras. And I'm going to make a new, just a regular group is fine. I'm going to call this Arcane Power. And then using these little arrows, just going to toss them in the group. And you can see that they're all sort of spread around, not really that nice. So under Display for the group, I'm just going to set their X and Y offsets to 0. So now they're all nice and stacked up. I'll drag this down here somewhere. Minus 300 is probably good. And I suppose the last thing I can do is set some load conditions. So I'm going to say maybe in combat, when player class is a mage, and when my talent spec is the first tree. The first tree, if you go under specializations, is the top one, so Arcane in this case. So that'll do. Anything else I might want? I suppose I can take this AP ready and we'll give it a simple animation. Let's say that its main animation is a preset. Pulse is probably fine. So let's see how that looks. There we go, so we got our pulsing icon here. We get a nice green, use your arcane power rotation or whatever. When we lose the buff, we get the cooldown for it. Awesome.